signed last year. Olivia Marks-Wolman is Chief Executive of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. It kind of does what it says on the tin, but we'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. Dr. Sian Williams, psychologist and broadcaster. She has recently announced she's leaving her role as presenter on Channel 5 News. I might ask her about that as well. And Justine Greening, founder of the Social Mobility Pledge, former Conservative MP and Cabinet Minister. Is she missing being in politics? I know the answer to that because we speak quite often, Justine, don't we? But we'll talk a little bit about that too. Now, the number you need to ask the questions, you can answer your own question if you like, 0345 6060 973, and of course you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's crack on with our first question. It's from Tony in Doncaster. Hello, Tony.
Hello, Ian.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
How does the sanctioning of Roman Abramovich help the Ukrainian army to prevail in the war?
Right. I don't know how many of you are football fans, but of course Roman Abramovich was sanctioned at the end of last week. Chelsea Football Club is essentially in a very precarious financial position now, which I think if you're a football fan, anybody, it doesn't matter whether you're a Chelsea fan or not, I think regrets that. Olivia, let's come to you first. I don't know if you are a football fan, but what's your view on this?
I don't know whether I ought to admit that our household is more of a rugby one. But to answer your question, Tony...
I never understand rugby, but anyway, carry on.
Tony, thanks for the question. I think we need to see this in the context of everything that is going on with the war and what the government is doing. Sanctions are one element, one measure in this entire catastrophe that we're seeing unfold. And when sanctions are being implemented, they have to be done without fear or favour, and looking at all the people who can be said to be in contact with Putin's regime in the Kremlin. And we also have to look at all the measures that Britain is sending weapons and military aid to the Ukrainians. We've just announced today, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that later this evening, support for refugees. So there are many different elements in this situation, and sanctions are just one of them, and seem to be having an effect.
Justine.
The way that...
Of course, a lot of your former constituents are probably Chelsea supporters, aren't they? Because you were MP for Putney.
Half support Chelsea, half support Fulham, which is why I'm still a supporter of Rotherham United. Made my life a lot easier. No, I think the challenge is that the way President Putin runs Russia is through some trusted counterparts, including his oligarchs and also organised crime. He uses that network to shift money around for his own purposes, a bit like a fiefdom. And the allegation is that Roman Abramovich was absolutely part of that network. And therefore, if you really want to stop Russia accessing its wealth that it has chosen to store abroad, conveniently using our own system to do that, and places like London, then you have to get into some of those networks, and that's why the government, I think, has taken the action it has on Abramovich. And of course, it's just a tragedy for Chelsea Football Club. And I think my sense, reading from the outside, is there's a genuine desire not to get to the situation where it has a dramatic impact on Chelsea. Clearly, Abramovich is in the midst of a sale. So I think there's a sense that there's almost a short-term challenge of that football club and Abramovich's interest, but the desire to try and see it now transition across to somebody who's not part of that network.
I was reading today that it's likely to be sold to a Saudi group, so it's sort of out of the frying pan in some ways. Andy McDonald.
Well, Middlesbrough playing Chelsea on Saturday, so we'll be hopefully seeing them off as we did Spurs and Manchester United in the previous rounds.
But no need to boast.
I know, but I just thought I'd get it in quick. But I think implicit in Tony's question is how effective is this going to be? And I think in the immediate term, it's probably of limited impact. But I think, as Olivia said, this is just one of many responses that are necessary and appropriate. And I think a lot of us think that this has just taken too long. We've known about this abusive relationship for a long time, and we've had an open door policy to dirty money.
Why do you think it has been tolerated?
Why questions weren't asked and why certain demands? I think it was convenient, but we're certainly seeing how it's infiltrated our economy and our politics, and it's certainly a wake-up call, but it's a bit late. That's my real sadness about this. Had we taken a tougher line about these the dirty money that floods into London through these sources, I don't know. I'm not saying for 1 minute you wouldn't get the invasion of Ukraine had we been quicker off the mark. I'm sure that's not right. But we should not have tolerated this, and we've put up for it far, far too long. But at least now we're paying some proper attention for the first time. My concern is it's the gap, the opportunities for people to salt away their, what I would call ill-gotten gains. I mean, it's because it's the Russian people's money that they've taken, their businesses, and they've now got this space and time to rearrange their affairs. And I thought, that's... But we haven't been good enough.
But wasn't it interesting here that they made the decision on the very day that a Chelsea sale looked as if it was going to be completed? They got in there before it was completed. Now, I can't quite work out the logic of that. I suppose the logic was, well, we didn't want Abramovich to get the 2.5 billion pounds that he would have got, and if it's sold now under this government freezing position, he won't get the money.
Well, he won't, and if that holds firm and is effective, then that's been the right way to go. But I know a lot of his financial transactions have been suspended; they've been frozen, so he's not able to hopefully manoeuvre stuff around. I've got my doubts whether there are any back doors left open. Where's his yacht? Where is he at the moment? I don't know. Like many of them, they will have alternative arrangements, I'm sure.
Sian, what did you make of the reaction of Chelsea fans to this? Because they were cheering his name at the weekend, weren't they?
They were, and they've been asked not to in the future. I wonder, Tony, whether you're a Chelsea fan in Doncaster. I know, he may still.
Are you Tony or are you Doncaster Rovers?
Neither.
Neither. I mean, I think it sends a signal, doesn't it? Saying, up with this, we will not put any more. But, I think all of our panellists have expressed the point, actually, that we have made uncomfortable friendships over the years that we're now trying to extricate ourselves from, and it's difficult and tricky. You raised the point that it might be sold to the Saudis. Well, what's our relationship with the Saudis as well? I mean, there's who executed 81 men on one day, which is more than they had done.
That might come up later, so let's not go into that, because we're actually going to be talking about that in detail after 9.
Oh, well, there we are. But I mean, it just shows, doesn't it, that over the years, perhaps we have developed these friendships that are now quite uncomfortable to sit with. I was in Moscow 30 years ago when they opened the new McDonald's and capitalism was on the rise and communism was falling. There was a great hope then that the relationships might be very different, and it's proved not to be the case, sadly. So some things have to be done, and some things have to be done very visually, and this is a very visual statement. Just like saying, for example, that oligarchs' homes are going to be, they won't be able to get access to their homes. We saw what happened today as well with those being occupied by squatters so that Ukrainians could perhaps live there. But it's not comfortable, but I don't think any of this is comfortable.
To answer Tony's question directly, though, how does this actually help with the war? I mean, sanctioning Russian oligarchs, how does that help Ukraine?
How does it help Ukraine? Well, perhaps it puts a halt to some of the flow of money that's been flowing so easily, I would say, in the first instance. I can see that, if you take Chelsea and you take the war on Ukraine and you look at it, there's such a vast gap between the two. You think, how on earth could the two be linked? But I think it's part, isn't it, of a series of measures that might interrupt that flow of money that's been so uncomfortable for everybody to sit with.
Tony, thank you very much for your question. Let's move on to a text question from Coloured in Oldham. 25,000 people and organisations have recorded their interest in the Homes for Ukraine scheme. Is it the right approach? Andy McDonald.
I have my reservations. I wouldn't, because if you look at the scheme, it's basically saying register, and then go and find somebody to bring into your home. So it seems a bit of a DIY scheme, and I'm not sure how the government expect that to work fluently. If it is that if you know somebody that and you've got a family or an individual, they're known to you, you're up and running. If you don't, you've got to find some other way. And I find that a little bit, it's not distasteful, but I can see that this is going to be problematic. There'll be many, many people who want to do the right thing and open their doors. And that's a wonderful expression. I think that's just absolutely brilliant that people respond in such a way. But how will that convert into receiving people into your home? Making the offers one thing. But I just think there's a big gap there. And leaving it to people to go and find people to sort of almost recruit, I think it's asking too much.
Isn't it a little easier than that, though? Isn't it the fact that there'll be many, many charities that will be collecting lists of people who need accommodation, and it will be up to us or whoever as individuals to contact those charities and say, right, I can take whatever. Can you match me up with somebody? It's not going to be, I think, quite as random as you may suggest.
Well, there's nothing on the website that would tell you where to look. There's no sort of list of named charities as yet. Perhaps that's yet to come. That would be good if that was the case. But at the moment, it's just that front end on the portal, and I fear that may not work as effectively as we'd wish. And if that's the case, you're going to have lots of people just sitting wanting to help, and nobody coming through the door. I also think there's lots of other people that we could be of assistance to as well. I had so many constituents with families trapped in Afghanistan that the same offer wasn't made, and of course you've got other conflicts across the world. So if that's a change in tone, a change in approach to reaching out to refugees, because people often quote our proud history from the 39-45 conflict. Well, let's see that engrossed now, but not just for this conflict, but for all people who are fleeing war and torture.
Sian Williams.
Oh, this is such a tricky one. My understanding is there's going to be two phases. So the first phase is there's got to be a named individual, and how that works in terms of, I don't know, is that some sort of social media matchmaking? I'm not quite clear about that, but on the government website, which I looked at as well, and it says you've got to contact them directly, fill in a visa application by Friday with details of both, or on Friday. And you would not be expected to cover the costs of food and living expenses, although you may wish to offer this philanthropically, it says, quite interestingly. But then the whole sort of charities, church communities, looks like it's going to be a second phase to be announced. I was at church yesterday, and we were talking about how we might support it as a community. So if people wanted to help but didn't have room, for example, or wanted to help, did have room, but had some reservations about putting somebody up or a family up for at least 6 months, which actually, with everything that comes with it, and from my perspective, there's a huge mental health need as well. I'm not sure that how that's going to be supported, but it needs to be, because, having worked in this area, those refugees are going to come with a lot of trauma, a lot of vigilance, a lot of fear, a lot of loss, a lot of grief. That's going to be very difficult to manage, and that needs specialist help. And I would be arguing, where is the specialist help to support any of these families and communities that are taking in refugees? Because we need to know that now. And the Refugee Council needs to know that now too.
And the fact is, it isn't there, is it? Because if it was there, it would have been deployed during COVID.
Yeah, well, and maybe, exactly, well, there is that, of course, but maybe it's also the fact that we have lagged so far behind in our response thus far that there has been a kind of, right, let's do it now, we'll work out all those details later, we'll just get it moving. But I would like to see some really detailed plans on how individuals and communities are going to get the wider support that is needed. It's not just about the 350 quid. It's not just about the 10,500 that's going to be offered to each refugee family. It is far wider than that, and it's going to take years. Anyone who's, I remember covering a story, the Kosovan refugees, this was years ago, who went to Glasgow, and there was the Scottish government did did that incredibly well, and the community really supported the Kosovan refugees, and it worked, but it worked because there was a decent structure, and I think that's what we need to see now.
Justine.
Well, I led the Syria response on behalf of the UK when I was Development Secretary, and when I look at how we worked with the UN system, it was well organised. We knew exactly what each part of the system was doing, whether it was providing shelter, water and sanitation, healthcare, food. And I think the challenge in this refugee crisis is, of course, the reason you needed that response often is we were doing it in countries that found it incredibly hard to cope with people suddenly arriving. But of course, as developed countries, the assumption is that we put in place those very systems ourselves. And actually, I think we should recognise there's almost two parts of this. One is what we need to do for refugees, both upstream, who are leaving Ukraine and then stopping in places like Poland, Moldova. And then what we need to do downstream for those that want to come to the UK. But it's also what we worked incredibly hard in Syria on was helping host communities. So for people living in parts of Lebanon and Jordan that literally saw their populations double in a matter of weeks, it was hugely difficult for them to cope, even when they were opening up their doors. So people weren't necessarily turning up in refugee camps, and this is very similar to what's happening in Ukraine. They were literally finding places to stay, renting local rooms. The price of accommodation was being driven up. They were then trying to pay for that through getting a job locally. Salaries were being pushed down, often in communities that themselves were already very poor. The children were, of course, steadily turning up at local schools to try and get some education. If you suffered from diabetes and you were leaving Syria, you eventually found your way into the local health service to say, can I get my treatment here, please? We even had challenges around the local sewage system being overwhelmed, the public refuse collection system being overwhelmed. And so I think it's more than just supporting the refugees. We have to have a really bolted down strategy for supporting host communities in the region, but also here in the UK, who are going to find themselves really up against it in coping with people arriving in their midst if they do that in large numbers. I think the good news is we do know how to do this. And certainly Britain's got a fantastic track record through what was the Department for International Development on shaping those responses. And what we need to do is shape upstream with our European partners around the edges of Ukraine. But we should also be bringing all of that knowledge to helping ourselves cope as a country with what could be a lot of people. And if you look 11 years on from the Syria crisis, right today, the statistics are still that over half the people in Syria today have had their lives affected. Half of those are displaced people within Syria who had to move, just like we're seeing in Ukraine, and they haven't gone back. There's still 7 million Syrian refugees who left Syria and haven't gone back. And the reason they haven't gone back is that they have not just built lives outside of Syria, but they looked at what was back at home under a government led by Assad. And you can imagine how people in Ukraine may feel about a Ukraine that perhaps is ultimately led and taken over by Russia, and they choose to stay where they are, even if right now, Iain, their plans are to go home. And I spoke to many Syrian refugees who even 1, 2, 3 years in had no intention of leaving and wanted to go back, but roll the clock forward and they steadily get to the place where they think, actually, we've got no choice because we just can't stay here for our children's future. We don't want to end up there with this crisis, and it's really incumbent on us to support countries like Poland who are now getting overwhelmed with help so that they can cope with what they need to.
I wanted to give Justine a long time to talk because she's the only one of us sort of been at the front end of this as a Secretary of State. But Olivia, I'm going to come to you, but we're going to go to a break first. It's 8:20.
LBC. Trust Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:23, we have Andy McDonald, Olivia Marks-Wolman, Sian Williams and Justine Greening with us answering your questions. We were in the middle of answering a text from Khaled in Oldham who said 25,000 people and organisations have recorded their interest in the Homes for Ukraine scheme. Is it the right approach? Now, I imagine you've got a bit of experience with this, Olivia.
Well, yes, at the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, everything we do is looking at where identity-based persecution can lead if it's not challenged. And of course, at the heart of Holocaust Memorial Day is the Holocaust. And many of your listeners, I'm sure, know about the Kindertransport Initiative, which brought over so many children before the outbreak of World War II. Now, why was it called the Kindertransport? It's because the children were brought over here. Their parents weren't allowed. So I'm glad to see we seem to have learnt some of the lessons with this initiative being announced today, and that this is being open to Ukrainians who are fleeing, Ukrainians of all ages. And we've seen from what we do on Holocaust Memorial Day, the difficulties that many of those children faced. Most of them never saw their parents or family members again. They were murdered in the Holocaust. At the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, we also work with survivors of recent genocides, many of whom came over here as refugees and have rebuilt their lives here. In answer to the question, my goodness, don't we feel helpless when we're watching what's going on, feel so impotent, and that desire to do something, whether it's making a donation financially or wanting to offer our homes. As I think Sian said, offering our homes is a big ask. It's not right for everybody. But for some people, it is something they will be able to do, and we need to see more details coming forward of what the vetting will be, picking up on Andy's point, being able to accommodate Ukrainians who aren't known to us, so who aren't matched through knowing them. But that appears to be something that will be coming. And it's one of the things that some people can do. But all of us, I think, can't speak for everybody in the country, but so many of us want to do something to help.
And I think the point is that everyone can do something. As you say, opening up your home is not going to be right for every single person. A lot of people won't have the space even if they wanted to do it. But everyone can donate to the DEC or other charitable institutions. Khaled, thank you very much for your question. Let's go on to another text question from Maya in Blackheath. Sian is a psychologist. Are we really prepared to accept a load of refugees from Ukraine who are likely to have PTSD and who knows what other mental health problems? We can't even look after people here. Well, we sort of briefly touched on that before, but it's a good point, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I really do get your point, Maya, and I think, Iain touched on it earlier when he said the need for mental health support during the pandemic was huge, and we've had 2 years of that. And now a war with Ukraine, in which we may well see people coming into the UK who do need specialist mental health support. And there is no doubt that if you are fleeing from war, you have it's this thing of sort of location, dislocation, relocation. And in the dislocation and relocation, that is a very, very tricky time for them to manage. So they will absolutely need some help. And I do worry that the help isn't necessarily there. I know a lot of psychologists who work in trauma like me. I spent some time working in Kent with families in acute trauma, and the need is great on our doorstep. I do appreciate that, but I think people who are coming here will come with a new and different set of issues, especially children, and there are people who can help in that regard, in terms of recognising avoidance, withdrawal, fight, flight, making sure that they feel connected, secure, safe, that their past and what they've experienced isn't directly playing into what's happening now. It is a very big ask for a family to do that. I do appreciate that, which is why I mentioned that point, Iain, earlier, which is there needs to be specialist support out there. There are loads of brilliant counsellors, mental health workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, but and many of us offer our time and will continue to offer our time pro bono because it's what we do and what we like doing. I think the support is going to be huge. I'm seeing it just with my work with journalists. I do the news every day, but I'm also in touch with teams on the ground in Ukraine and also who are processing news footage in the office. And I think, and just talking to the audience as well, that a lot of the images are incredibly difficult to deal with and to process. And those really complex feelings of wanting to look, but wanting to turn away, the guilt, am I doing enough? What more could I be doing? The anxiety, am I right to hold this anxiety? When I see what's going on, what right have I got to be anxious? So enormously complex feelings that each one of us are experiencing. I would also say something that was mentioned to me actually by a psychologist friend who's working directly with child refugees at the moment. And she said, please be aware of what this is doing and bringing back for the refugees who have settled in this country, who might have managed their trauma, but they will be re-experiencing some of it, and that might
and there are so many other
difficult
aspects to this as well. Andrew Marr had a guest at the end of his show earlier where they were talking about how do you explain Ukraine to children, British children.
Yeah.
And we did an hour a couple of weeks ago on what I called war anxiety, and the number of people, even in the last few days that I've spoken to, who you think are very well adjusted, it doesn't matter what their ages are, very well adjusted, but they are becoming incredibly anxious about the prospect of nuclear war.
And why would they not be? Why would they not be? But I remember as a friend of mine who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, she was 11, and she said that she remembers this awful feeling of dread, but nobody telling her what was going on.
I remember that. I was 6 months old.
But I think as far as children are concerned, if they are feeling real distress or anxiety, you have to get it out and have a look at it and say it's understandable for you to be feeling like this, but also make sure that you provide the feeling of safety so that they can feel that they can talk about difficult emotions. We can't give people certainty. We can't give our children certainty. We don't have certainty. We don't know what's going to happen next, but we can just take moment by moment and do the best we can in that moment.
And we'll hear from our other three panellists in just a moment. You're listening to or watching LBC's Cross Question. It's 8:30. Andy Ivey has the news headlines.
20,000 potential hosts have now registered online for the Homes for Ukraine scheme. Sponsors will receive £350 a month for each family taken in, but Labour says the visa application process for Ukrainians fleeing the war is unnecessarily complex. The United Nations is warning that millions of people in Ukraine are suffering because of dwindling supplies of food, water and medicine. It's offered a further £30 million in humanitarian aid. 4 people have been arrested following a protest on the balcony of a Russian oligarch's mansion in London. Demonstrators occupied the property in Belgrave Square and displayed banners calling for an end to the war. LBC weather: clear spells with some patchy frost overnight. Tomorrow, sunny spells and feeling quite warm in England and Wales with a high of 15 degrees.
This is LBC. This Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:34, Andy McDonald, Olivia Marks-Wolman from the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, Sian Williams and Justine Greening with us. Just on your work at the Holocaust, every time I say this, I say the wrong thing. I think I said Education Trust, and that's an entirely different organisation, isn't it? The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. I mean, what's your day-to-day work?
So everything we're doing is to support and promote Holocaust Memorial Day, which happens in January, but it has a big effect, and it takes place in organisations right across the UK. So it's Stornoway, it's Torquay, it's thousands of organisations will mark the day in prisons, in cinemas. So what we're doing is encouraging them to put on events for their groups, whether it's their audience, their church congregation, the prison inmates. And these are events that help people learn about the past and take responsibility for what they're learning. When we learn about what happened in the Holocaust, when we learn about what's happened in very recent genocides, what do we do with that knowledge and that empathy that develops as well? And it's encouraging people to take action in their communities. And of course, what a young offender in can do is so very different from what my mum can do in Ealing when she goes to the Borough Council's event. But they all do something. We know that they all go on to do more. We've had an inmate in McGillingham prison in Northern Ireland come back to the prison after he was released to help with their Holocaust Memorial Day activities for the next group of inmates, because he felt so passionately about what he'd been learning and what he could go on to do. So that's the essence of our work, and all through the year we're encouraging that.
Well, let's continue with the question from Maya in Blackheath, who's asking about, are there going to be enough resources to handle the mental health problems that refugees might experience? We've heard from Sian. Olivia?
I can't add more than what Sian is our
Andy.
expert. Can I say? But I would say two very quick points. Firstly, we're dealing with an emergency. It's an absolute emergency what's happening. It's a military emergency, humanitarian emergency. And we have to step up and to deal with that because of our shared humanity. And what leads from that is the other point, very briefly, about the language. We have to treat everybody with respect. When we talk about refugees, they're people, they're humans like us. We have to be mindful that historically refugees have been treated with a great deal of prejudice, not a long time in history. It happens today, and we should be mindful of our shared humanity and treat everybody with respect and frame our debate as we are doing today with the questions and the conversation in a very respectful way. And in a complex situation, we mustn't lose sight of people's humanity.
I'm tempted to think of a very disrespectful way of introducing Andy, but I wouldn't dare. Andy?
Well, on this, I think Maya hits on a very important point about political choices. And I think as we learned through the COVID experience that, there were needs that people had that we as a society haven't addressed properly. So the point is a valid one, that resources are stretched. And I know as a former lawyer dealing with serious injuries, just how difficult PTSD is to deal with. It's incredibly intensive and demanding. But that doesn't mean we walk by on the other side. We've got to treat people with decency and with compassion in this crisis. And the fact that, this is going to be difficult for us to receive doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But I think Maya hits on a very, very good point. And it applies not just to mental health, but to other services as well, that we now see, I think, through a different prism of saying these are so valuable and so fundamental to the human condition, and we have paid ill attention to them for such a long time. We need to have a change of priorities, and that requires political choices in terms of how we resource things.
Justine, very briefly, if we can.
I remember as we drew to what seemed to be the close of the Syria civil war, there was a discussion from the humanitarian community that we recognise it would be far easier to rebuild Syria physically than to help its population get over the trauma of what had happened to millions of them. And I think that will be the case here, and it won't be built up overnight to have the level of expertise, for example, that Sian has to support people. We'll need people who can speak in languages, that are the appropriate ones for these children. The only other point I'd make is getting them into school and education, having some kind of normality for families around children just simply getting into school and being with other children is one of the most important ways that they can just feel like there is some sort of structure to the day. And I think in terms of helping the smallest and young children and young people to be able to cope with this, being able to talk to teachers, being able to do art that expresses what you've seen and been through, being able to do stories, and all of that is part of how you can start to give young people an outlet for coming to terms with what's going on in their lives. And also, my final point is, Syrian children were always scared that nobody knew what they were going through. And that's what they used to say to me. Does anyone know what's happening to us here? And we did a big push called No Lost Generation with Save the Children as DFID, because we wanted to make them realise that them getting into education, back into schools, supporting their psychosocial mental health was really, really important to us. And it's not enough just to help refugees survive the crisis that they're going through in Ukraine. We've got to help make sure they don't just get a life today, but that we're helping them have their futures for tomorrow.
Maya, thank you for that. Let's go to our next caller. Tony's in Streatham. Hi, Tony. What would you like to ask the panel?
Yeah, hi, Iain. What I would like to ask the panel, what is the point of the Prime Minister telling the world not to buy Russian oil or gas when he's planning to go to Saudi Arabia to visit that evil regime?
Andy McDonald.
Well, it's a real dilemma, and of course it comes at a time when a few days ago 81 people were executed, and that question was raised in the House today, saying do not go, but the Prime Minister is going because he feels he needs to pay attention to our energy security. I think.
Do you understand that?
I understand why. And I understand the motivation to go to Saudi Arabia and say, can you increase the flow of oil, please, because we've got a crisis. But of course, do remember that we as a country are not dependent upon Russian oil to the same extent as other European countries. So I'm a little bit curious as to why that is needed now. That's the premise, that the supply is being undermined. But it's a hugely important issue. We have had these relationships, and we're talking about crisis across the world. There's a crisis going on in Yemen as well. And Saudi Arabia have got a major role in what's happening there. That's been going on for 8 years. And we see those children in the most awful of circumstances. And yet this is a regime that we seem to be content to continue to deal with. The urgent question in the House today was the answer from the minister was that we're in a position of friendship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and therefore we can have robust conversations. That means nothing if it doesn't produce any consequences or better outcomes for people, and that isn't happening. So I find this a very, very false position for the United Kingdom, but it does beg broader questions about how we break away from dependency upon regimes that we feel very, very ill at ease with. And that's why I think we've got to make that progress around renewables, making that sprint for energy security of our own, to stop us having to depend on people like this.
Justine?
Well, I mean, to add to what Andy's just said, yes, we can't be energy secure overnight, but it underlines that, yeah, of course, we have relationships with countries that have very mixed records when it comes to human rights in particular. For Saudi Arabia, it's nevertheless worked with us sharing intelligence on combating anti-terrorism. But I think it underlines that in the end, we are dealing with these countries because actually we're not energy secure, and we do end up needing a relationship with them. And certainly for the wider world, as Andy said, actually, we're less in that position than most countries in reality. But for a wider world, the decisions that OPEC are about to take on oil production will not just impact how much oil there is, but also crucially signals to the market. And so for all those people who are wondering how on earth they're going to afford to fill up their car, actually just simply getting more certainty from the Saudis and OPEC more widely about oil production in the coming weeks, could be a crucial step to help on cost of living with people right here, and that's the reality of it.
Olivia.
I agree with what they're both saying. The government is in very, very difficult place, has to make very difficult decisions, work with people that they don't want to work with, but we have to reduce our reliance on their energy. And it's part of the government's wider strategy about our sustainable energy sources and looking to reducing that reliance.
Okay, Sean?
It is a lesson for the future, isn't it? Which is we wouldn't have chosen to be here to be looking, as Tony suggests, at dependency on another hostile regime, where 81 men were executed on Saturday, which is more than were executed over an entire year in Saudi Arabia. So I think it's incredibly difficult, and I think as you drive past petrol stations and you see the price ticking up and up and up.
179.9 in my local one.
Was it really? 179.9.
And this time last week it was 154.
Yeah.
And yet, apparently the price of oil has gone down by 25% in the last few days. So you just wonder if there's a little bit of profiteering going on here.
Well, we know that some of the big oil companies have made huge multi-billion-pound profits, don't we?
And they would point out that the previous year they made huge multi-billion-pound losses.
They would indeed.
But there comes a point when if we all as customers feel ripped off and we think that they're all profiteering, I mean, that's not a good place for those companies to be in, is it?
It isn't, but it's Hobson's choice, because where do people go? They need to get into their cars and drive to work. They need to be able to drive to wherever they're going and be able to afford it. And we're looking at a cost of living crisis as it is. So it is uncomfortable. It is really, really uncomfortable. But because we don't have a sustainable network currently where we can draw our energy reserves from, I think at the moment, where else are we going to get our energy? How do we do it?
I was feeling slightly smug last week, having just bought an electric car, which I initially didn't like. But then on Friday, I charged it up at one of these, at a charging point in a petrol station, thinking it would cost me like a couple of pounds. I only charged 10%, and it was like £10.54. And I'm thinking, I thought this was going to be cheaper.
Well, of course, there's also the lithium in I've got an electric car as well, but that's not an entirely environmentally friendly option because it's got lithium in the battery. But
right, we're going to move on to something very different in a moment with our panel. It's 8:47.
Tonight with Andrew Marr, only on LBC.
A Russian oligarch's mansion was taken over today by protesters. The police piled in. Utterly absurd. I wonder whose side the Mayor of London is on. Sadiq Khan is with me now.
I was surprised, though. Look, it does raise questions. He said, I don't know the facts, but I do understand.
You will be talking to the Commissioner about this.
I of course understand the concerns about the issue of whether this is a proportionate response.
Quite seriously, a lot of London families, if they're burgled, you phone up the police don't turn up. But for this...
Tonight with Andrew Marr returns tomorrow from 6 p.m. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
10 to 9 on LBC. We have Andy McDonald, Olivia Marks-Wolman, Sian Williams and Justine Greening with us answering your questions. Elaine has texted in a question. She's in Islington saying, is there a better illustration of how the power of the state is exercised, above all else, for the protection of private wealth rather than the stream of riot police heading into a Russian oligarch's Belgravia flat that was being occupied today? I got burgled last week and I've barely had more than a crime reference number. Sadiq Khan was on with Andrew Marr earlier and he sort of slightly brushed this away, which I thought, well, that's a bit odd. And Andrew said, have you spoken to the commissioner about this? Because there were literally dozens of police vans outside this place. And I gather there are only like 4 or 5 squatters there. And he said he hadn't. And I thought, well, maybe you should have done today. Sian, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I didn't see the pictures of the vans going in. I think it's that there are, where I used to live in North London, there were quite a few empty homes run or owned, I think, by Russian oligarchs, some of which had squatters in them. And there's the government will say, well, squatting is illegal and this shouldn't be done. The squatters are saying we're doing it to show that there is space for Ukrainian refugees to come and live. It's not right or legal, but it shows it makes a very clear statement. We have a lot of empty homes, don't we, in the UK that could be put to better use. Whether they needed to go in as heavy-handed as your caller has suggested. Well, no, not if she hasn't got a crime number and she was burgled last week.
But do you think that is symptomatic of what people's view is now of the police? Well, it's that they will lift every hand that they can to help somebody who's rich, but if it's an ordinary punter who's been burgled, they just don't seem to care.
Do you think? I'm not sure.
Oh, you listen to this programme more than you'll hear the callers.
Really?
Yeah, say that.
Well, that's a real shame, isn't it?
I don't know whether that's the same throughout the rest of the country, but it certainly seems to be the case in London. Justine, before you answer this, quiz question for you on this. 5 Belgrave Square, that was the home of which former Tory MP?
Absolutely no idea.
Chips Channon, because I'm reading his diaries at the moment.
Well, I've learnt something tonight. Thank you, Ian.
So, what do you think about this?
Oh, I obviously understand the point those people were making, but I just really watched the news and felt like the police had got better things to do than have to move them on. And that, not that they should be allowed to stay, I just felt you could have done a protest outside. You did not need to go inside. You didn't need to end up consuming a huge amount of time and resources of the local police. And I think, for the Met, they're sort of damned if they do. They're damned if they do, damned if they don't. Had they allowed them to stay in there in a very public display of, illegal behaviour, there would have been somebody probably emailing and saying, this is terrible, why didn't they get them out? That's outrageous. You can't just squat in people's, homes. On the other hand, as Elaine's saying, it is deeply frustrating when you suffer crime and it feels like you're not getting a response from the police.
Andy?
Well, it's the proportionate response. I mean, because it's a dirty great house in Belgravia or wherever it was, you'll get this army of police officers coming to sort it out. I feel a bit uncomfortable about that, especially in my constituency.
Would that happen on one of your
No, it
council
wouldn't.
estates?
It really wouldn't. People would struggle to get a response, and as you rightly say, crime number, trying to ring the police officer to get progress made. Not being critical of the police officer concerned, but their resources are such they couldn't devote all of that attention to one single case. But I also think the issue of protest is important. This is uncomfortable, and I think Justine's right. It doesn't feel right. People invading another space. Hang on. Are we really going to clamp down on people making a protest and making a point so markedly? We've got a bill going through the Commons at the moment that's going to restrict people's right to protest, and I think we've got to be a little bit careful about this. People all over the world are protesting and expressing their view. We should listen to them. We should also think about taking some of these properties and making them available to refugees.
Absolutely.
I mean, my accommodation in central London, most of the time it's in darkness because nobody lives in these blocks.
Or maybe it's about converting some of that empty office space that's just around lots of cities,
Absolutely.
unused hybrid working. Now it's time to make them available for perhaps some refugees who need that space if we can quickly
think of the
convert
planning
them.
consents that will be required for that.
I need to cut through that.
Olivia.
Underlying this question is that inequality between wealthy and not wealthy people. And we know that over the past couple of years of the pandemic, inequalities have grown enormously, inequalities in education, and and wealth is protecting people from some of those worse effects. And as we face a future with really high cost of living increases, the worry is that those inequalities are only going to get worse. And that's not a good situation for any of us to be in, because when that happens, we know that fear and prejudice against other people just exacerbates and gets worse. And in the context of what we've also been talking about with refugees coming to this country, we're facing a situation where we really need to be mindful of not letting those inequalities blind us to each other's humanity and doing what we can to reduce inequalities.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to go to a final question, but you need to promise me that you can answer it in 30 to 45 seconds each. Shahid's in Hemel Hempstead. Shahid, fire away.
Yeah, hi. I think that the opinion polls are indicating the next election will be a hung parliament. With that in mind, wouldn't the Conservative Party be better off if the proportional representation voting system was in place, as it's likely to result in them getting much more seats in Scotland and maybe Wales too?
See, now you're all really grateful. I've limited it to 30 to 45 seconds, aren't you, Andy?
What was the question we're being asked? Do we approve of PR?
No, would the Tories be better off with PR in the next election?
Well, if we have 38% of the vote and we have a massive majority of 80 seats, I'm starting to have my doubts.
42%.
42%,
yeah.
Okay. But even so that's more people voted for other parties than voted for the Conservative Party, and we've got this whip hand of an 80-seat majority. So, I'm having my doubts as to whether that's a sustainable position for us as a country any longer. So, whether they'd be any better off, that's, the Conservative Party made their own minds up about that.
Olivia?
We'd all be better off if more people voted, full stop.
That's profound, and that was only 7 seconds. Well done, Justine.
And we'd all be better off if more people voted full stop and they felt like those votes really genuinely counted. So there probably is now space for a debate on the voting system. But in a way
I've never bought this argument that if you live in a seat where you don't win, your vote doesn't count.
Yeah. We've got to get to the polling station as well, with 2 million people excluded now having to use ID.
Don't start
there we are.
Don't start on that one. Sian?
I think there's room for a better system. I'm not sure what it looks like.
There you go.
At least you're honest.
I think we all want the
right,
debate.
our fun text question for the end. Janine in Beverley in East Yorkshire says, Power of the Dog has won the best film at the BAFTAs. What's the best film you've seen in the past 12 months? Justine?
It was The Power of the Dog. It was brilliant. I don't know what I expected. I watched it. It was incredible. Psychological drama. Definitely watch it.
Andy?
Well, I'll have to revisit it because I fell asleep halfway through and didn't want to go back to it. But now everybody's encouraging me. I will. But I think you should look at Munich. That was a better film.
Olivia?
I can't think of a film because I just went to the theatre at the weekend to see the play production of To Kill a Mockingbird, and it was outstanding.
Sian?
Oh, I like both the films suggested. Haven't seen To Kill a Mockingbird. I would go for Belfast.
I want to see that.
Have you seen it?
No, I want to.
I think it's really well worth seeing. It's lovely. It's as lovely as it can be. A sort of film shot in black and white in the Troubles. It
Is it all in black and white?
as I remember most of it. But it is, isn't it, Andy?
I haven't seen it. I know it's in black and white, but I haven't seen the film.
But you should, because it's a lovely film. And it's beautifully done by Kenneth Branagh.
I generally don't
beautiful.
like black and white films.
Wait, but the fact that I couldn't even remember whether it's sustained in black and white is a reason to go and see it.
I will
because
watch it.
You'll get over that.
Thank you all very much indeed for coming on the show tonight. Sian Williams, Justine Greening. We never got to talk about why you've decided to leave.
Have we run out of time, Ian?
Well, go on, 30 seconds.
Sadly,
30 seconds.
I want to concentrate more on psychology, and I'm going to continue to do broadcasting in some form or another. But yeah.
Well, we could maybe combine the two, he says. There's a thought, hey? Sian, thank you. Justine, Olivia and Andy, thank you. And don't forget, you can catch up on all past episodes of Cross Question on the Cross Question podcast. Coming up in a moment, we're going to be asking, should Boris Johnson be going to Saudi Arabia just a few days after the Saudis executed 81 men in one day? 0345 6060 973. This is a number to call if you've got strong views on that, and I'm sure you have. You're listening to Iain Dale on LBC. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the United Nations Refugee Agency says almost 3 million people have now fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion began 19 days ago. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres